The year of our Lord 1883 found Evelyn Carter rattling west on a train bound for nowhere in particular. The ceaseless clatter of steel wheels on steel rails had become the rhythm of her days, a sound that vibrated through the worn velvet of the seat and into her bones. Outside the grimy window pane, Wyoming unfolded itself as a brutal, beautiful emptiness, a land of sagebrush and sky that stretched so far it seemed to mock the very idea of a destination. It was a landscape that promised nothing and was therefore incapable of lying. Evelyn found a strange comfort in that. She was 32 years old and felt ancient. In the society she had fled a woman of her age, unmarried was a creature of pity or suspicion, a piece of decorative furniture left too long in the sun. She had been neither. She had been a bride. For one glorious morning she had worn white silk and pearls, her heart a fluttering bird in her chest, ready to take flight into a life she had believed was promised to her. Then the letter had arrived. A single sheet of cheap paper delivered by a smirking errand boy. Anonymous. Its words were crude, venomous, a lie spun from the bitterest thread, accusing her of a sin that a woman of her station could not survive. It claimed she was not pure. The accusation was enough. Her fiancé, a man whose poetry she had treasured, whose hand she had imagined holding until it was wrinkled and frail, had read it, and his face had turned to stone. There was no trial, no defense. In the world of New York society, a whisper was as good as a verdict. The wedding was canceled. Her life was over. So she had become a ghost in her own home, her reflection in the mirror, a stranger with haunted eyes. The pitying glances of her family, the triumphant sneers of her rivals, the suffocating silence that fell whenever she entered a room. It was a poison seeping into her soul. She could not breathe. One night she packed a single trunk with her most practical dresses, her mother's locket, and a small cache of money she had saved. She left a note that said, "Only forgive me." Then she walked to the station and bought a ticket with a single word printed as its destination, West. It was a ticket to anywhere as long as no one knew her name, a one-way passage to oblivion. The train was a rolling arc of lost souls. There were families with gaunt faces and desperate eyes seeking land they could call their own. There were young men with more muscle than sense, hoping to strike it rich in mines or on cattle drives. There were women whose pasts were as hazy as the smoke from the engine, their gazes hard and assessing. Evelyn kept to herself, a quiet figure in a plain gray dress, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. She wore a thin black veil, not in true mourning, but as a shield, a flimsy curtain between her and a world she no longer trusted. People assumed she was a widow, and she did not correct them. It was an easier story to wear than her own. A husband in the ground was a tragedy. A fiancé who had cast her aside like a broken toy was a scandal. She felt used, damaged. A fine porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together, the cracks still visible to anyone who looked too closely. Her faith in men had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and her faith in herself was not far behind. What good was a woman who could be undone by a lie on a piece of paper? What worth did she have if her entire future could be stolen by an anonymous hand? The questions echoed the train's rhythm, a merciless beat against her heart. Day after day she stared out at the passing land, at the herds of buffalo that looked like a slow-moving river of brown fur, at the jagged mountains that tore at the sky. She was running away, she knew that, but she was also running towards something. A place where a woman's past was her own business. A place where the dirt under her fingernails from honest work might matter more than the purity of her bloodline. Days blurred into a week. The plush velvets of the eastern cars gave way to hard wooden benches. The passengers grew rougher, their speech plainer, their gazes more direct. Evelyn ate dry biscuits and drank lukewarm water from her canteen, learning to sleep upright against the vibrating wall of the car. She was shedding her old self layer by layer like a snake sloughing its skin. The delicate sensibilities of Evelyn Carter of New York were useless here. What she needed was grit. She was not sure she had any. Finally, the conductor, a man with a tobacco-stained beard and a voice like gravel, announced a stop. Dust Haven. The name was not promising. Through the window, she saw little more than a collection of weathered wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. A single dusty street served as its main artery. There was a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a few other structures that seemed to be held up by sheer force of will. The train hissed to a halt with a great sigh of steam, as if exhausted by its journey. A few passengers disembarked, their movements weary. Evelyn did not know why, but something told her this was it. This was as far as nowhere went. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her small satchel and stood. Her legs were stiff from the long ride. She stepped carefully down from the car, her boots sinking into a fine red dust that seemed to cover everything. It was the color of dried blood. The air was hot and dry and carried the scent of dust horses and something faintly like despair. She stood on the rough timber platform, feeling small and utterly alone. This was her new beginning. It felt remarkably like an end. Just then, a fierce gust of wind swept across the prairie, a sudden, violent breath that howled through the small town. It tore at her bonnet and ripped the black veil from her face, sending it tumbling through the air like a wounded crow. She gave a small cry of dismay, reaching for it, but it was gone, dancing on the wind across the dusty street. She watched it go, a piece of her old life, her flimsy protection cast away by the raw power of this new world. The veil landed in the dirt near the feet of a man who had been standing in the shadows of the station's overhang. He moved without haste, bending down to retrieve it. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a simple linen shirt and a leather vest that held a tarnished star. He walked toward her, his steps measured and quiet, his boots making little sound in the thick dust. As he drew closer, she could see his face. It was a face carved from the harshness of the land itself, all sharp angles and sun-weathered lines. He was not handsome in the way the men of New York were handsome. There was nothing soft or polished about him. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight, uncompromising line, but it was his eyes that held her. They were gray, the color of ash after a fire has burned itself out. They held a profound stillness, a deep-seated weariness that she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection. He stopped before her, holding out the veil. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, his gaze missing nothing, taking in the weariness around her mouth, the faint tremor in her hand, the defiant tilt of her chin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she brushed it away, her heart beating a little faster. In his silence, she did not feel judged or pitied. She felt only seen. He was the first person to look at her in months without a question in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and quiet, a contrast to the howling wind. It was the sound of calm in the middle of a storm. Evelyn reached out and took the veil, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, calloused. It was the hand of a man who worked, who fought, who held on to things. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, her own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. She had only glanced at the star on his chest, but she knew. He was the law in this place of dust and endings. He gave a slight nod, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving Evelyn Carter standing alone on the platform with her reclaimed veil in her hand, and the red dust of Dust Haven settling upon her shoulders like a shroud. The train to nowhere had brought her here. She had a terrifying feeling she had just arrived. Dust Haven was less a town and more a temporary argument with the wilderness. Its buildings were unpainted wood, bleached bone gray by the relentless sun and scoured by the equally relentless wind. The red dust was a constant presence, a fine powder that coated window sills, settled in the bottom of water glasses, and worked its way into the very weave of a person's clothes. Law here was a fragile concept, a line drawn in that same dust easily blurred or blown away. It was a place for people who were either running from something or had nothing left to run to. Evelyn Carter was not yet sure which category she fell into. Her first task was shelter. She found it in a small room above the seamstress's shop. The seamstress, a wiry woman named Martha with the eyes as sharp as her needles, looked Evelyn up and down with an expression that was not unkind, but held no illusions. She saw the quality of Evelyn's dress, though it was plain, and the soft, uncalloused skin of her hands. She saw a woman who did not belong. She took Evelyn's money without a word and gave her a key. The room was small and clean, with a single window that overlooked the main street. It was a perch from which to watch and be watched. Her second task was work. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and her savings would not last forever. She found a position at the town's only eatery, a noisy establishment that smelled of fried bacon and stale beer. Beatrice, the owner, was a broad woman whose face was a roadmap of a hard life. She hired Evelyn to serve tables and wash dishes, her decision based not on Evelyn's experience, which was none, but on the quiet desperation she saw in her eyes. Beatrice knew that desperation was a better motivator than any wage she could offer. And so Evelyn's new life began. It was a life of small routines and constant observation. The people of Dusthaven were a closed book, quick to notice a new page, but slow to read it. They watched her as she walked to work in the mornings, her posture still too straight, too refined for this slouching town. They watched her as she served them stew and coffee, her hands clean, her voice soft. They whispered behind their hands. A woman her age traveling alone was an anomaly, a puzzle they felt compelled to solve. The most common theory was that she was running from the law. Another was that she'd been a woman of loose morals in a bigger city and had been run out. No one considered the simple truth that she was running from a broken heart. That was a wound too common to be interesting. Evelyn learned to live with the weight of their gazes. She focused on the work, on the burn of lye soap on her hands, on the ache in her back at the end of the day. It was an honest exhaustion, a clean pain that overshadowed the messier ache in her soul. She learned the names that went with the faces. Mr. Henderson, the portly general store owner, Jebediah, the blacksmith whose hammer blows were the town's morning bell, the quiet ranch hands and the loud prospectors. And she learned about Sheriff Caleb Rhodes. He was a fixture as constant and silent as the distant mountains. He was a widower, the townsfolk said. His wife and child had been lost years ago in an attack on their homestead. Since then, he had been the town's sheriff, a man who enforced the law with a quiet authority that was more effective than any amount of shouting or gunplay. He lived alone in a small log cabin that stood beside the jailhouse, its windows dark and empty. His only companion was a powerful black horse he called Ash, which he cared for with a gentle meticulousness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. He came into the eatery every evening at the same time. He would take the small table in the corner, the one with its back to the wall. He would nod at Beatrice and order the same thing, beef stew and black coffee. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping the room. He never made small talk. He just watched. Evelyn would serve him her hand, trembling slightly the first few times. He would look up at her, his gray eyes unreadable, and murmur his thanks. The silence that surrounded him was a physical thing, a wall that no one dared to breach. One evening, the saloon doors flew open and a trio of cowboys stumbled in. They were young, full of liquor and the particular brand of arrogance that comes from having spent too many months on a cattle drive with only steers for company. They were loud and coarse, their laughter grating on the relative quiet of the room. They took a table in the center and immediately turned their attention on Evelyn. "Well, look what we have here," the leader, a man with a cruel twist to his lips, drawled, a pretty little songbird far from her nest. Evelyn ignored them, placing a plate of food in front of an old trapper. Her back was rigid. She had felt this kind of unwanted attention before, though it had been cloaked in the finer language of a New York drawing room. The intent was the same, to diminish her, to make her an object. "What's the matter, little bird? Cat got your tongue?" Another one sneered. She turned to face them, her expression a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. "Can I get you gentlemen something to eat?" The leader leaned back in his chair, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel sullied. "Oh, I think we'll have a bit of you." The other men laughed. Beatrice shot them a venomous look from behind the counter, but they paid her no mind. Evelyn felt a familiar cold dread creep into her stomach. She was alone. There was no one to defend her honor. She was a woman without a husband, a father, or a brother in a town that respected only strength. "I believe you are mistaken," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "The menu is on the table." The man stood up, swaggering toward her. He was taller than her and smelled of sweat, whiskey, and cattle. "I don't need a menu. I know what I want." He reached out to grab her arm. Evelyn flinched back, but there was nowhere to go. The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen. And then a chair scraped against the wooden floor. It was a quiet sound, but in the sudden tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned. Sheriff Caleb Rhodes was on his feet. He did not say a word. He did not draw his gun. He simply stood by his table in the corner and looked at the three cowboys. It was the most unnerving stillness Evelyn had ever witnessed. His face was impassive, his body relaxed, but his eyes were not. They were like chips of flint, hard and cold and promising sparks. The air crackled with a silent warning. The lead cowboy's bravado seemed to shrivel under that silent gaze. He looked from the sheriff to Evelyn and back again. The smirk on his face faltered. He slowly lowered his hand. "Just having a bit of fun, Sheriff," he mumbled, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. Caleb did not respond. He just continued to look at them. The seconds stretched on. The other two cowboys began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, the leader seemed to break. He cleared his throat and took a step back. "We were just leaving," he said. He threw a few coins on the table and practically herded his friends out of the eatery, their swagger completely gone, replaced by a hasty retreat. The room collectively exhaled. The low murmur of conversation started up again. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked over at the corner table. Caleb Rhodes was sitting back down as if nothing had happened. He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. Evelyn walked over to his table, her legs unsteady. She needed to say something to thank him. He looked up as she approached, his expression unchanged. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. Hesitantly, she sat down. He stared into his coffee cup for a moment before speaking, his voice low and even. "Out here, ma'am, silence speaks louder than guns." He said it not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact, a law of this land as unchangeable as the setting of the sun. Those types are like coyotes. They only prey on what they think is weak. You show them you are not, and they will leave you be. Evelyn looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. She saw the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the deep-set loneliness that even his formidable calm could not hide. She had seen him as the law, as her rescuer. But now she saw something else entirely. She saw a man who understood loss. It was there in the hollows of his face, in the weary set of his shoulders. It was an ache she knew intimately, a ghost that sat at her own table every night. Her gratitude was real, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a different feeling, a flicker of recognition, a kinship of broken things. She was not just looking at the man who had saved her from a moment of ugliness. She was looking at a man who knew what it was to have your world torn apart and be left to stand alone in the wreckage. He was no shining knight. He was just a man with the scars as deep as her own. And in that desolate town, under the watchful eyes of strangers, that was a more profound comfort than any chivalrous act could ever be. An unspoken understanding settled between Evelyn and the sheriff in the weeks that followed. It was not friendship, not yet, but a quiet acknowledgement of shared space, a mutual respect for the solitude each of them carried. His presence in the eatery each evening became a fixed point in her day, a silent anchor. He never spoke of the incident with the cowboys again, and for that she was grateful. He had not made her a damsel in distress. He had simply cleared an obstacle from her path and allowed her to continue walking it on her own. The room above the seamstress's shop was a cage, however clean and safe. Evelyn yearned for something more. A space that was wholly hers, a place where she could shut a door and not hear the life of the town through the floorboards. On the far edge of Dust Haven, where the last structures gave way to the endless prairie, stood a small abandoned cabin. It was little more than a wreck. The roof sagged. The door hung from a single hinge and the windows were empty eyes staring out at the wilderness. But the land it sat on was unclaimed and the structure itself had good bones. Evelyn saw not what it was, but what it could be. A home. She spent her meager savings at the general store on a hammer, nails, and a saw. The work was harder than anything she had ever known. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her muscles screamed in protest. She made slow, clumsy progress, patching the roof with salvaged timber, trying to square the door frame. The town watched her efforts with a mixture of amusement and pity. It was a fool's errand for a woman alone. One afternoon, as she struggled to lift a heavy support beam into place, a shadow fell over her. It was Caleb Rhodes. He stood there for a long moment watching her, his gray eyes taking in the sweat on her brow, the splinter in her palm, the sheer futility of her effort. He did not offer help. He did not offer pity. "That beam will not hold," he stated. It was a simple observation. "I am aware of that, Sheriff," Evelyn replied, her voice tight with frustration. He looked from the cabin to her, and then at the book she kept tucked in her apron pocket, a small volume of poetry she read on her breaks. "You can read," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. And write." "Yes." He considered this for a moment. "I have reports to file. Official correspondence. My hand is not good. I never got past the 3rd grade." The admission was made in the same flat tone he used for everything, but Evelyn heard the flicker of proud vulnerability beneath it. "I will fix this house for you. You will teach me to read and write properly." It was not a request for a favor. It was a business proposition, a trade of skills as practical and unsentimental as the town itself. A trade between two people who had something the other needed. "All right, Sheriff," Evelyn agreed. "You have a deal." And so a new routine began. Every afternoon after his duties were done, Caleb would come to the cabin. He worked with an efficient economy of motion. He did not waste a single hammer blow or a single step. Under his skilled hands, the sagging roof straightened. The door swung true and glass was fitted into the empty windows. He was a creator, a builder, a man who knew how to make something whole and strong out of broken pieces. Evelyn worked alongside him, sanding wood, fetching tools, and slowly she began to feel that she too was being rebuilt. In the evenings, the roles were reversed. They would sit at the small table in her newly habitable cabin, the light from a kerosene lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She would guide his large, calloused finger across the lines of a primer, his brows furrowed in concentration. His hand that was so steady with a hammer was clumsy with a piece of chalk. He would form the letters slowly, meticulously, as if carving them from stone. She was patient, teaching him the sounds, the shapes, the way words could be built and strung together like beads on a string. It was in the quiet of these lessons that the walls between them began to crumble. One evening he was trying to write a letter, a difficult task that involved conveying a delicate matter to a marshal in another territory. He struggled to find the right words to express the nuances of justice and mercy. Frustrated, he put down the chalk. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "She was the one for words. She could talk the birds from the trees, and our boy Daniel, he was just like her." Evelyn remained silent, letting the space fill with his memories. It was 6 years ago. He continued, his eyes fixed on the dark window pane as if seeing a scene only he could see. "We had a small ranch a few miles from here, a group of men riding through. They were not bandits. They were just mean. For the sport of it. They wanted what we had and they took it." He stopped. The silence in the small cabin was absolute. I was in town for supplies. When I got back, there was just smoke and silence. The kind of silence that screams. He did not need to say more. Evelyn could picture it, the devastation, the absolute emptiness that had greeted him. She understood now the source of his own profound quiet. He lived in the echo of that scream. His confession hung in the air, a fragile offering, and Evelyn knew she had to offer something in return. A few nights later, as they sat at the table, she reached into a small pouch she always kept with her. She pulled out a worn piece of cardstock and laid it on the table between them. It was her one-way train ticket. "I have never shown this to anyone," she said softly. He looked at it, then back at her, his gray eyes questioning. "This is why I am here. It is my ticket to nowhere." She told him not of the crude letter or the shame, but of the dream she had lost. The dream of a home, a family, a life built on trust. I was to be married. She explained, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I thought I had found a safe harbor, but a rumor, a cruel whisper, was all it took to destroy it. I was discarded. Because of a lie someone told, I learned that a woman's worth is as fragile as a pane of glass. So I decided to go where I had no worth at all, where no one knew my name. I thought if I had no destination, I could never be disappointed when I failed to arrive." He picked up the ticket, turning it over in his fingers. He understood. He had lost his destination in fire and smoke. She had lost hers in a whisper. The cause was different, but the result was the same. They were both adrift. The work on the cabin was finished. It was a small, sturdy home, a testament to their shared labor. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler. One afternoon, as the sun began to hang low in the sky, painting the prairie in hues of orange and deep purple, Caleb appeared at her door with Ash and another horse saddled and waiting. "There is something you should see," was all he said. They rode out from the town, leaving the dust and noise behind. They rode in a comfortable silence, a language they had both come to understand better than words. He led her to a high bluff that overlooked the vast expanse of the plains. The sky was a canvas of impossible color. The world seemed to hold its breath, caught in the beauty of the dying day. They dismounted and stood side by side, watching the sun sink below the horizon. A sense of peace washed over Evelyn, a feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten its existence. Here there were no judging eyes, no whispers. There was only the wind, the sky, and the quiet man standing beside her. A lump formed in her throat, a mixture of sorrow for all she had lost, and a fragile, impossible hope for what might be. "I have never seen a sunrise so beautiful," she whispered, not realizing her mistake, her mind connecting the beauty of the moment with the idea of a new beginning. Caleb turned his head and looked at her. The last golden light of the sunset illuminated her face, softening the lines of weariness and revealing the strength that lay beneath. His expression was serious, his gaze direct. "You just did, ma'am," he said, his voice low and certain. "You just brought it with you." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was a validation, a recognition not of her beauty, but of her spirit, of the light she had thought was extinguished forever. She could not speak. She could only look at him as tears welled in her eyes. Tears not of sadness, but of a profound and startling gratitude. The fragile peace she felt on that bluff carried her through the next day. For the first time since arriving in Dust Haven, she did not feel like a ghost. She felt real. She walked into the general store to buy flour and sugar for her new home, a small smile on her lips. As she lifted a heavy sack of flour from a barrel, something fell to the floor. It was a folded piece of paper. Thinking it was a dropped receipt, she bent to pick it up. It was cheap paper, folded tightly. She opened it. The handwriting was a crude scrawl, completely unfamiliar. But the words were not. There were only a few of them, but they were sharp and poisonous, each one a dagger to her heart. "A whore from New York has no place here." Evelyn froze her hand, clutching the paper. The sounds of the store faded away, the cheerful chatter of Mr. Henderson, the clatter of goods on the counter. All she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. She looked around the store, her eyes wide with a new and terrifying fear. The faces of the other customers seemed to twist into knowing leers. The whispers she had imagined before were suddenly real, palpable. Her past had not been left behind. It had followed her across a continent and found her in this place of dust and second chances. The ticket to nowhere had led her right back to the prison she had tried to escape. She was known. The world shrank to the size of that single piece of paper. The weight of the flour sack in Evelyn's arms was forgotten. The cheerful noise of the general store became a dull roar in her ears, a sound from a distant world she no longer inhabited. Her past, which she had thought was a ghost, had just shown itself to have flesh and blood and a very sharp knife. She stumbled out of the store, leaving the flower where it lay, her mind a whirlwind of panic. Every face she passed on the dusty street seemed to hold a smirk. Every hushed conversation seemed to be about her. The fragile sense of peace she had found on the bluff with Caleb was shattered into a million pieces. The author of her misery did not stay hidden for long. His name was Earl McKinney. He was a man who carried himself with the easy arrogance of someone who believes he owns everything he sees. He owned the saloon, the livery stable, and the mortgage on half the businesses in Dust Haven. He was always immaculately dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots, a stark contrast to the rough-spun folk of the town. Evelyn had seen him before, watching her from the saloon doorway, his eyes lingering in a way that had made her skin crawl. He had the predatory stillness of a spider waiting in its web. He approached her the next day as she was leaving the eatery. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was meant to look gentlemanly but felt like a mockery. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "a word if I may." Evelyn's heart turned to ice. She knew. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. McKinney." "Oh, I think you do," he said, stepping closer, blocking her path. He lowered his voice. "A town like this is a delicate thing. Reputation is everything. A woman alone, a woman with a complicated history. Well, she needs a powerful friend, a protector." The threat was unmistakable, coiled beneath the surface of his solicitous words. "I do not need your protection." He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Everyone needs protection from gossip. Things get said, ugly things, about why a woman might leave a fine city like New York in such a hurry. Things about a wedding that never happened. Such stories could make life very difficult. They could make it impossible for a respectable woman to find work or even a place to live." He let the words hang in the air. "But with me as your benefactor, no one would dare whisper a word. You would be safe, cared for." Evelyn looked into his cold, calculating eyes and saw her choices laid bare. She could become his property, a bird in a gilded cage to be paraded as his latest acquisition. Or she could be cast out, her name and reputation shredded and scattered like ashes on the wind. There was no third choice. To fight him would be to have him shout her story from the rooftops, confirming the town's worst suspicions. He had her trapped. The same lie that had destroyed her life in New York was here to destroy it again. That night she did not go to the cabin. She could not bear to be in the space she had built with Caleb, a place that had felt so much like hope. She went to her small room above the seamstress's shop and sat in the dark. Defeat was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had been so foolish to think she could escape. The world was small, and a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily broken. She made her decision in the cold hours before dawn. She would not submit to Earl McKinney, and she would not stay to be humiliated. There was only one path left to her, the one she had taken before: to run. She moved with a quiet efficiency born of despair. She packed her small trunk again, the few dresses, the locket, her book of poems. It was a familiar ritual, a reenactment of her flight from New York. At the bottom of the trunk, she found the worn piece of cardstock, her one-way ticket west. She had kept it as a reminder of her journey into nothingness. Now it was her only salvation. The next train heading east was due the following night. She would be on it. She would go somewhere else, anywhere else, and start over again. And again if she must. This was to be her life, a series of new beginnings that were really just continuations of the same ending. Caleb knew something was wrong the moment he saw her. He had come to the cabin that evening for their lesson, but she was not there. He found her at the eatery, moving through the tables like an automaton. The light he had seen in her on the bluff, the light he had told her she brought with her, was gone. Her eyes were dull, shadowed with a pain she was trying to hide. He sat at his corner table and watched her. She avoided his gaze, her movement stiff and unnatural. When she brought his coffee, her hand trembled so badly that the liquid sloshed into the saucer. "Evelyn," he said, her name a quiet question. She would not look at him. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice a flat monotone. He knew then that whatever had happened, it was a wound too deep for casual conversation. He left the eatery and began to ask questions, not directly, but in his own quiet way. He spoke to Beatrice, whose eyes were full of worried sympathy for her new server. He spoke to Mr. Henderson at the general store, who mentioned how the woman had fled his shop the other day, leaving a sack of flour behind, as if she had seen a ghost. And he spoke to one of his deputies who had seen Earl McKinney talking to her on the street. The pieces began to fit together. Caleb knew McKinney. He knew the man's appetites, his cruelty, his need for control. He found McKinney in the saloon, preening before his cronies. Caleb walked in and the room fell silent. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood before McKinney, his gray eyes cold as a winter sky. "You will leave her alone," Caleb said. McKinney laughed a confident, braying sound. "I do not know what you are talking about, Sheriff. I was merely offering my assistance to a lady in need." "I know what you offered," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "And I know what you threatened. This is the only time I will tell you. Stay away from her." He turned and walked out, leaving McKinney fuming in a room full of silent men. But Caleb knew it was not enough. He had seen the look in Evelyn's eyes. It was the look of a creature already caught in a trap, a creature that had given up the fight. He knew the train schedule as well as he knew the sunrise, and a cold certainty settled in his gut. The train station was a lonely outpost in the vast darkness of the prairie night. A single oil lamp cast a sickly yellow glow on the empty platform, creating more shadows than it chased away. The wind was a mournful whisper, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Evelyn stood alone, a small, solitary figure with her trunk at her feet. She clutched her old ticket in her hand, the cardstock a flimsy shield against the immensity of her failure. Old bride, with one-way ticket west. The phrase echoed in her mind, a cruel epitaph for a life that had never truly begun. She heard the faint whistle of the approaching train, a lonely cry in the night. It was the sound of her escape. A footstep crunched in the gravel behind her. She did not need to turn around. She knew. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking. He came to stand beside her, not touching her, just a solid presence in the swirling dark. He looked at her sad face, then down at the ticket clutched in her white-knuckled hand. His own face was a mask of harsh lines in the lamplight. "The train will be here soon," she said, stating the obvious, her voice hollow. "I have to go." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. The train whistle sounded again, closer this time. "You can leave Evelyn," he said, and the use of her name without the formal ma'am was a sudden, shocking intimacy. His voice was rough but steady. "Or you can stay and let me be the man who does not care where you have been, only where you will go. With me." The words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. They were everything she had never dared to hope for. Acceptance, a future, a place where her past was not a life sentence. A wave of emotion so powerful, it buckled her knees, washed over her. The carefully constructed walls around her heart shattered. Sobs tore from her throat, great wrenching gasps of grief and relief, and a terrifying, fragile hope. She looked at his face, his impossibly kind gray eyes. And she looked down at the ticket in her hand, the symbol of her endless running. With a choked cry, she ripped it in half and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter from her fingers and be carried away by the wind. They danced for a moment in the lamplight like white moths before disappearing into the darkness. He stepped forward then and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. He held her tightly, his arms a circle of strength and safety in the vast loneliness of the night. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his touch gentle. He held her as the train roared into the station, its arrival a cataclysm of steam and screeching steel. It waited for a few moments, its great engine panting like a beast. Then, with another mournful whistle, it began to pull away, gathering speed until its red tail lights vanished into the blackness of the prairie. They were left in the sudden, profound silence. He tilted her face up to his. The tears were still wet on her cheeks. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression full of a feeling she could not name. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and fierce possession acclaiming. It was hungry and deep, and spoke of years of loneliness, and Evelyn kissed him back with all the pent-up yearning and broken dreams in her soul. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a kiss that remade the world. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, the wind whipping strands of her hair around their faces. "Then it is settled," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vow in the quiet night. "From this night on, I am the quiet sheriff who will claim forever by your side." To lose in Dust Haven was to lose face, and Earl McKinney was a man who considered his face his most valuable asset. The news of the sheriff and the Eastern woman at the train station spread through the town like a prairie fire. It was not the kind of story that was shouted, but the kind that was whispered over sewing baskets and beer mugs, a currency of sidelong glances and knowing smiles. McKinney felt every single one of them like a physical blow. He had offered the woman his protection, his patronage, and she had chosen the silent widower sheriff, a man who owned nothing but a horse, a cabin, and a tarnished star. It was an insult of the highest order, a public rejection of his power. He would not stand for it. His authority was built on the perception of strength, and Caleb Rhodes had made him look weak. Killing the sheriff himself was too crude, too direct. It would bring marshals and questions. But humiliation was a different kind of weapon, a poison that worked slowly and just as surely. He needed to break not just Caleb's body, but his legend. The town saw Rhodes as an unflappable force of quiet justice. McKinney would show them he was just a man who could be made to bleed and beg like any other. He sent a telegraph, and a week later a stranger rode into town. He was not like the loud, drunken cowboys who periodically disturbed the peace. This man was lean and quiet, his clothes dusty from a long ride. He had a still, watchful quality, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, seemed to miss nothing. He carried a Colt Peacemaker low on his hip, its handle worn smooth with use. He took a room at the boarding house and said his name was Miller. He spent his days in the saloon playing cards for small stakes, never drinking more than a single whiskey, and watching. Mostly he watched the sheriff's office. The town felt his presence like a change in the weather, a coming storm. Evelyn felt it too. The days following that night at the station had been a strange and wonderful dream. She and Caleb had not spoken of love or forever again. The words were not needed. The promise had been made. He took his meals at her cabin, now the small home their shared hands had built. They would sit in the evenings, he laboring over his letters and reports, his brow furrowed in concentration. She stood reading aloud to him from her book of poems, her voice a soft counterpoint to the chirping of crickets outside. It was a simple domestic peace she had never believed she would find, but a shadow had fallen over it. She saw the way Miller's eyes followed Caleb when he walked down the street. She felt the tension in the town, a low hum of anticipation. One afternoon, as she swept the porch of her cabin, Caleb rode up on Ash. He dismounted and came to stand before her, his face serious. "I have to ride out to the old Miller place," he said. His boy rode in. Said a couple of rustlers are trying to run off his stock. Evelyn's heart went cold. "Is it wise to go alone?" "It is my job, Evelyn," he said simply. He then did something he had never done before. He reached out and touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I will be back before supper." He went into the cabin and returned a moment later with the rifle he kept by the door. He also carried a small, hefty revolver. He pressed it into her hand. It was cold and heavy. "I showed you how to use this," he said, his gray eyes boring into hers. "I do not think you will need it, but this land is full of surprises. Know how to answer them." He mounted his horse, gave her one last long look, and rode out of town, heading west into the vast emptiness of the prairie. Evelyn stood on the porch, the gun heavy in her hand, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She watched until he was just a small speck against the horizon. The sky to the west was a bruised purple, a sign of a coming storm. The wind began to pick up, kicking red dust into the air and stinging clouds. The boy from the Miller place had ridden back out of town almost as soon as he had arrived, his face pale with a fear that looked too old for his young years. An hour passed, then another. The sky grew darker. The wind began to howl a low, mournful sound that seemed to tear at the edges of the world. Then she heard it faint at first carried on the wind, the distant pop-pop-pop of gunfire. She did not hesitate. Dropping the broom, she ran into the cabin, her mind racing. She remembered the horse, a gentle mare she had rented from the livery to ride out to the bluff. She grabbed a canteen of water and her shawl, stuffing the heavy revolver into the deep pocket of her apron. She ran to the livery stable, the wind tearing at her hair and clothes. The stable owner, a grizzled man named Silas, tried to stop her. "You cannot go out in this, Miss Carter. It is a squall coming on. The sheriff can handle himself." "I heard shots," she said, her voice frantic. "Give me the horse, Silas." Seeing the look in her eyes, he relented. She threw the saddle on the mare with clumsy haste, her hands shaking. She mounted and kicked the horse into a gallop, riding out of town in the direction Caleb had gone. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of red dust and screaming wind. The visibility dropped to a few yards. The dust was a living thing, a choking, blinding curtain that stung her eyes and filled her lungs. The horse was frightened, tossing its head and trying to turn back, but Evelyn spurred it on her own fear, a cold, hard stone in her gut. She was no longer the delicate woman from New York who had fainted at the sight of a mouse. She was a woman riding into a storm to find the man who was her anchor in the world. She did not think about needing to be saved. She only thought about the possibility of Caleb needing her. She found them in a shallow ravine a mile from town. Ash stood nearby, his reins trailing in the dust, his powerful body trembling. Caleb was pinned down behind a cluster of rocks. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, his sleeve dark with blood. A few yards away, another man was crouched behind a pile of boulders, methodically firing at the sheriff's position. It was Miller, the hired gun. He was calm and professional, taking his time. He was toying with Caleb, wearing him down. This was the humiliation McKinney had paid for. Evelyn slid off the mare, her heart pounding against her ribs. She pulled the revolver from her pocket, its weight a grim reality in her hand. Caleb's lessons came back to her in a rush. Hold it with both hands. Do not pull the trigger, jerk it. Squeeze it slowly, like you are shaking a man's hand. He saw her, then a flicker of movement through the swirling dust. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a raw terror that was not for himself, but for her. "Evelyn, get out of here! Ride!" His voice was a raw shout, nearly lost in the wind. Miller heard him. He turned his head and saw her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. This was an unexpected bonus. Not only would he kill the sheriff, he would do it in front of his woman. He raised his pistol, taking aim at her. Time seemed to slow down. The howling of the wind faded to a dull roar. Evelyn saw the barrel of the gun swing toward her. She saw the coldness in Miller's eyes. She was not a victim. She was not a ruined bride. She was a woman of the West now, and she would not be prey. She raised the revolver with both hands, just as Caleb had taught her. She steadied her arms against the side of a rock, taking a fraction of a second to line up the sights on the center of Miller's chest. Her fear was a cold, sharp point, but her hand was steady. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands with a deafening roar. For a moment, she thought she had missed. Miller stood frozen, his smile still on his face. Then a dark spot blossomed on his shirt. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound surprise. He staggered back a step, looked down at his chest as if he could not believe what he saw, and then he crumpled to the ground, his body a limp heap in the red dust. Silence. The only sound was the wind, which seemed to be slowly dying down. Evelyn stood trembling, her ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had done it. She had taken a life. There was no triumph in it, only a grim, nauseating finality. She ran to Caleb, stumbling over the rocky ground. He was leaning against the rock, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His eyes were fixed on her with an expression of awe and disbelief. She knelt beside him, her hands fluttering over the bloody wound in his arm. "I am all right," he rasped, though it was clear he was not. He looked past her at the body of the man she had shot. "You did it, Evelyn. You saved me." She shook her head, the tears she had held back finally streaming down her face, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. "You taught me how," she whispered. He reached out with his good hand and cupped her face, his touch grounding her. "No," he said, his voice full of a raw emotion she had never heard from him before. "I taught you how to shoot. You learned how to survive all on your own." She leaned into his touch, finding strength in his nearness. The storm was passing. The thick red dust was beginning to settle, revealing a world washed in a strange amber light. The dust clung to the blood on Caleb's arm, a stark and brutal painting. A woman of the West does not need a man to save her, Evelyn thought, looking at the quiet sheriff who had claimed forever by her side. But she still chooses to love one, and she will ride through hell in a dust storm to stand with him. Looking at Caleb's weary face, she knew she was no longer a passenger with a one-way ticket to nowhere. She was home, and she would defend it. Getting Caleb back to town was an ordeal of grit and whispered prayers. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Evelyn managed to get him onto his horse Ash, who stood with a patient stoicism that seemed to mirror his master's. She led the two horses slowly, her own body screaming with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. Every step was a battle against the trembling in her legs. She held the revolver in her hand, no longer a symbol of terror, but a tool, a weight of responsibility she had proven she could carry. By the time they reached the edge of Dust Haven, the first curious faces were peering from windows. The sight of the sheriff slumped in his saddle, his arm crudely bandaged with a strip of his own shirt, and Evelyn walking beside him, her face, a mask of grim determination, sent a shockwave through the small community. Men came running. Silas, the livery owner, and Jebediah the blacksmith gently lifted Caleb from the saddle, their rough hands surprisingly tender. They carried him not to his own dark and empty cabin, but to hers. It was an unspoken decision, an acknowledgement that his home was now with her. Dr. Miles, a weary man who had seen more than his share of gunshot wounds, was summoned. He worked by the light of a kerosene lamp, his instruments clinking softly. Evelyn stood by, handing him clean cloths and hot water, her movements steady and competent. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was a painful wound, but it would not be a fatal one. "He was lucky," Dr. Miles said as he finished stitching the wound. He looked at Evelyn, his gaze assessing. "You were luckier. Not many women would have ridden into that storm, and even fewer would have come out of it with the man who did this to the sheriff laid out in the dust." He shook his head, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You have got more sand than I would have credited you for, ma'am." And so began the quiet days of healing. The world shrank to the four walls of the small cabin. Evelyn's life became a rhythm of care. She changed his bandages twice a day, cleaning the wound with a gentle touch. She brewed thin broths and spooned them into him when he was too weak to lift his head. She sat by his bed for hours, reading to him from her book of poems, her voice a low murmur that was the only sound in the room. In his fevered sleep, he would sometimes cry out a name. Sarah. The sound was a ghost in the room, a sharp pain of a past she could never know. But she did not feel jealousy. She felt only a deep and aching tenderness for the man and all he had lost. He was not a good patient. He was a man accustomed to action, to being the protector, not the protected. He chafed at the enforced stillness, his frustration a low thunder in his quiet silences. But he accepted her care with a grudging gratitude that she found endearing. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, her presence a constant source of calm. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that he had only glimpsed before. She had faced down gossips and gunmen, and she had not broken. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the room in soft shades of gray, he was sitting up in bed, his back propped against the pillows. His fever had broken, and the color was returning to his face. Evelyn sat in a chair beside him, mending one of his shirts, the needle moving with a steady rhythm. "This feels familiar," he said, his voice still a little rough. Evelyn looked up. "What does—" "Being cared for," he admitted. "Sarah. She had a knack for it." She could make a man feel whole again just by being in the same room. Evelyn's hand stilled in her lap. I am not her Caleb. I know, he said, and his gray eyes were clear and direct. I have not for one moment thought you were. He reached out with his good hand and covered hers. His skin was warm and rough against her own. When you rode into that ravine, I was not afraid of dying, Evelyn. I was afraid of you dying. I was afraid of being left in that silence again. The silence you have filled. Her heart ached with the truth of his words. She knew that silence. She had lived in it for months. They were two solitary people who had found in each other a quiet song that drowned out the ghosts. The town is talking, she said softly a few days later, about me staying here, with you. He nodded. Let them talk. It is not proper, she whispered, the old fears, the old shames of her past life bubbling to the surface. A woman's reputation. Your reputation, he interrupted, his voice firm, is that of the woman who saved the sheriff's life. Your reputation is that of a woman who is not afraid. That is the only kind of reputation that matters out here. He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened. But if it is a ceremony you are worried about, if you need the words of a preacher to feel safe. Evelyn thought of the white dress, the pearls, the canceled wedding, the public humiliation. A church and a crowd of witnesses felt like a stage for another potential disaster. The thought of it made her feel cold. He seemed to read her mind. I do not need a piece of paper from a judge or the blessing of a man in a black coat to know what is in my heart, he said quietly. My vows to you were made that night at the train station. They were made when you rode into that storm. We do not need a crowd and a preacher to tell us what we already know. His words were a release. He was offering her not a marriage in the eyes of the world, but a union of two souls, a quiet healing of the wound that had sent her fleeing west in the first place. He was telling her that their private truth was all that mattered. That night the air in the cabin was different. It was charged with a new and unspoken intimacy. The healing was no longer just about his physical wound. It was about them. After she had helped him change into a clean shirt for the night, she turned to leave for the small pallet she had made for herself on the floor. His voice stopped her. Stay. It was not a command. It was a plea. She turned back. He had moved over in the narrow bed, making a space for her. The light from the single lamp cast his face in shadow, but she could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She walked to the bed and sat on the edge, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He reached up and gently untied the ribbon that held her hair, letting it fall in a dark cascade over her shoulders. His fingers traced the line of her cheek, her neck. It was a touch of reverence, of wonder. There was no feverish passion, no desperate rush. Their first night together was a quiet conversation of touch, a slow and gentle exploration. It was an acceptance of scars both visible and hidden. In the soft lamplight, she saw the old white lines on his chest and back, mementos of a life of violence. And he, in turn, seemed to see the invisible wounds she carried, the raw places of betrayal and shame, and he touched them with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It was a mending of two broken halves, a silent vow spoken not with words, but with a shared breath in the stillness of the night. It was a quiet healing, a final profound peace. The next morning, Evelyn woke up curled against him, his good arm holding her close. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe. Later that day, while Caleb was sleeping, she retrieved the pieces of her ripped train ticket. She took a small piece of wood he had left over from repairing the cabin, and with painstaking care she fashioned a simple frame. She fitted the torn pieces of the ticket together inside it like a puzzle. The words, "One Way" and "West" were still visible, a testament to a journey that had ended in a way she could never have imagined. She hammered a small nail into the wall beside their bed and hung the frame. It looked small and insignificant, but to her it was a monument. It was not a reminder of a flight from a broken past. It was the marker of a new beginning, a symbol of the moment she had stopped running and had chosen to stay. The old bride with a one-way ticket had finally found her destination. It was not a place on a map. It was in the heart of a quiet sheriff who had claimed forever by her side. The change in Dust Haven was not a sudden flood, but a slow turning of the tide. It began with the small things. When Evelyn walked to the general store now, Mr. Henderson would tip his hat and ask after the sheriff's health, his eyes holding not suspicion but a genuine concern. Beatrice at the eatery started saving the best cuts of meat for her, wrapping them in wax paper with a knowing look that said more than words ever could. The women of the town who had once whispered behind their hands now offered quiet smiles and nods of acknowledgement. They had seen her ride into the storm. They had seen her walk back out leading the wounded sheriff. In this land of harsh realities, such an act was a language everyone understood. It spoke of courage, loyalty, and a fierce kind of love that was as unyielding as the landscape itself. Evelyn Carter, the mysterious Eastern woman, was gone. In her place was Evelyn, the woman who had saved their sheriff. She had earned her place not by conforming to their expectations, but by shattering them. She had not been a damsel needing rescue. She had been the rescuer, and in the unwritten code of the West that commanded a deep and abiding respect. Caleb healed slowly but surely. With his arm in a sling, he began to walk the town again, a quiet presence that had lost none of its authority. His gaze was still as watchful, his silence still as profound, but there was a new softness around his eyes when he looked at Evelyn, a protective tenderness that was plain for all to see. He and Evelyn lived in the small cabin on the edge of town, their life together an open secret that had become the town's new and accepted reality. The matter of Earl McKinney, however, remained an open wound. The man still walked the streets, his tailored suits and polished boots, a defiant statement of his untouchability. He had been thwarted, but not defeated, and his presence was a constant reminder of the venom that had almost driven Evelyn away. Caleb knew that for true peace to settle over the town and over their lives, McKinney had to face justice. One morning when the sun was high and bright, Caleb strapped on his gun belt, his good hand moving with practiced ease. He walked out of the cabin and headed not for the saloon but for the small office of the circuit judge, who was in town for the week. He presented his case calmly and methodically. He had the testimony of the Miller boy, who confessed that McKinney had paid him to lure the sheriff into an ambush. He had the half-dozen witnesses from the saloon who had heard him threaten McKinney, and he had the body of a hired gun buried on Boot Hill. It was enough. The arrest was a quiet affair, devoid of the drama McKinney would have preferred. Caleb, accompanied by two newly deputized townsmen, walked into the saloon in the middle of the day. McKinney was holding court as usual, a glass of whiskey in his hand. When he saw Caleb, he sneered. "Come for a drink, Sheriff. Or have you come to thank me for weeding out the weak from your town?" Caleb did not rise to the bait. He simply unhooked a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Earl McKinney," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room, "I am arresting you for the conspiracy to murder a lawman." The color drained from McKinney's face. He looked around at the faces of his cronies seeking support, but found none. The men who had laughed at his jokes and drunk his whiskey now looked away, their gazes fixed on the floor or the ceiling. They were afraid not of McKinney, but of the quiet, unshakable authority of the man with his arm in a sling. McKinney's power had been an illusion built on fear and money, and in a single moment it had evaporated. The town had chosen its side. He was alone. With McKinney gone, a palpable sense of relief settled over Dust Haven. It was as if the town could finally take a deep, clean breath. The dust still blew and the sun still beat down, but the air felt lighter. It was Evelyn who brought up the wedding. They were sitting on the porch one evening watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. "I want to stand up in that old church with you, Caleb," she said softly. He turned to look at her, his expression questioning. "I told you, Evelyn, I do not need that." "I know," she said, reaching out to take his hand, "and I do not need it to feel safe with you. I have never felt safer in my life. But this is not for us. It is for them." She gestured out at the scattered lights of the town. "It is a way of closing the book, of telling the world and this town that the past has no more power over me. It is a new beginning, Caleb. I want to begin it in the light, not in the shadows of what people might whisper." He understood. For him, their vows had been made in the dark of night at a lonely train station. But for her, who had been so wounded by public shame, a public declaration of their union was a final act of healing, a reclamation of her own story. "All right, Evelyn," he said, squeezing her hand. "We will do it in the light." The wedding of Dusthaven was not a grand affair. The old church was little more than a wooden shell, its steeple leaning slightly as if tired from its long watch over the town. Its pews were rough-hewn benches and its windows were plain glass. But the people of the town had swept it clean, and someone had placed a jar of wildflowers on the simple altar. Evelyn did not have a white silk gown. Martha the seamstress had helped her fashion a simple dress from a bolt of fine white cotton. It was modest and unadorned, and in it she looked not like a bride from New York, but like a woman of the West, strong and beautiful in her simplicity. Caleb wore his sheriff's uniform, cleaned and pressed, his tarnished star polished to a dull shine. His arm was out of the sling now, a testament to the quiet healing they had shared. The whole town came. They did not crowd into the small church. Instead, they gathered outside, standing in the dusty street, their faces turned toward the open doorway. They were a silent congregation of ranchers and blacksmiths and shopkeepers and weary mothers holding the hands of their children. They stood under the vast blue sky, the red dust swirling gently around their boots. They were not just spectators, they were witnesses. The circuit judge, a solemn man with a kind face, performed the simple ceremony. His words were nearly lost in the vastness of the prairie, but his meaning was clear. Caleb's vows were quiet, spoken in the low, steady voice Evelyn had come to love. He promised to stand by her, to be her shelter and her strength. Then it was her turn. She looked away from the judge and out at Caleb, his gray eyes fixed on her, full of a deep and unwavering love. Her voice when she spoke was clear and strong, carrying over the silent crowd. "I came west with a one-way ticket to nowhere," she said, her gaze locked with his. "And I found my forever in a man who speaks with silence." A ripple of understanding went through the assembled townspeople. They had all come west for one reason or another, seeking something they had lost or had never had. They all knew what it was to feel adrift in this vast and unforgiving land. They understood the profound truth of her words. She had not found a fortune or a fancy life. She had found something far more precious. She had found a home. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Caleb did not kiss her with the fierce, desperate passion of that night at the station. He leaned down and kissed her with a gentle tenderness, a kiss of profound peace and quiet joy. They walked out of the church hand in hand into the bright afternoon sun. They did not walk to a waiting carriage. They walked down the dusty main street of their town. The people of Dusthaven parted to let them pass, their faces open and smiling. The dust swirled around Evelyn's white dress, but she did not mind. It was the dust of her home. It was the earth that had witnessed two broken people find each other and become whole. The whispers had been silenced not by force or by fear, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of a love that had been forged in a storm and tested by fire. The old bride was a bride at last, and her forever had finally begun. 15 years is a long time in the life of a man, but it is a lifetime in the life of a town in the West. The Dusthaven that Evelyn had first seen from the window of a train, a place of desperation and bleached wood, was gone. In its place stood a town that had put down roots and decided to stay. The storefronts on the main street now boasted painted signs and clean glass windows. The general store had a second story, and the blacksmith shop had expanded to include a wheelwright. The saloon was still noisy, but now it was the noise of prosperous ranchers and merchants, not the desperate clamor of lost souls. And where the dust had once blown in unchecked sheets, there were now boardwalks and a few hardy trees that Evelyn herself had planted, their leaves a stubborn splash of green against the endless brown of the prairie. The most significant change was the small building that stood at the end of the main street. It was a schoolhouse with a proper bell and a small cupola on its roof. And every weekday morning its bell was rung by Mrs. Evelyn Rhodes, the town's schoolteacher. She had found her calling not in the drawing rooms of New York, but here in this one-room schoolhouse, teaching the children of Dusthaven how to read and write and cipher. She taught them poetry and history and the quiet dignity of a life built on honest work. The children adored her. She was strict but kind, and she had a way of seeing the unique spark in each of them. She was no longer the outsider, the woman with a past. She was the bedrock of the town's future. Caleb Rhodes was still the sheriff. The star on his chest was the same one, tarnished and unassuming, but the man who wore it had changed. The harsh lines on his face had been softened by the years by the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt. There was silver at his temples now, and a network of fine lines around his eyes from decades of squinting into the sun, but the eyes themselves were the same. They were still the color of ash, but now it was the ash of a warm hearth, not a consuming fire. His silence was still his hallmark, but it was no longer the silence of profound loss. It was the comfortable quiet of a man who is at peace with himself and his world. His authority in the town was absolute, not because of the gun on his hip, but because of the unwavering fairness and integrity with which he had served them for so long. Their life together had settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as the changing of the seasons. They lived in the same small cabin which over the years had been expanded and improved. A proper porch had been added where they would sit in the evenings, and a garden in the back produced enough vegetables to see them through the winter. It was a small kingdom of their own, making a fortress of quiet love against the harshness of the world. The framed and tattered train ticket still hung on the wall beside their bed, a relic of a past that no longer had the power to wound. It was a reminder not of what was lost, but of what had been found. One afternoon in the late fall, Evelyn stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching the last of her students run off toward their homes, their shouts and laughter fading into the clear, crisp air. She gathered her books and shawl, preparing to walk home when she saw him. Caleb was leaning against the fence post at the edge of the schoolyard, waiting for her as he did every day. He was not wearing his gun belt. He did not need to in the town anymore. The days of hired guns and ambushes were long past. He pushed himself off the post as she approached, a slow, easy smile touching his lips. "Did little Samuel Miller give you any trouble today?" he asked, his voice the familiar low rumble she loved. Evelyn smiled back. "He tried to convince me that 2 + 2 = 5 because his new calf has 5 spots. I told him his logic was admirable, but his arithmetic was not." They fell into step together, walking down the main street toward their home. It was a familiar ritual. The townspeople would greet them with a "Good evening, Sheriff Mrs. Rhodes," and they would nod back. They were a fixture, a landmark, as much a part of Dust Haven as the water tower and the church steeple. They did not need to speak much on these walks. They had spent 15 years in each other's company. They knew the contours of each other's thoughts as well as they knew the path home. They reached the cabin as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and red and purple. It was a spectacle of impossible beauty, a daily gift from the vast and empty land. They sat on the porch in the 2 rocking chairs Caleb had built, their shoulders gently bumping against each other. They watched the colors deep in the shadows lengthen. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of 15 years of shared sunrises, shared sorrows, and a deep and abiding love that had become the very air they breathed. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He looked out at the horizon, then turned his gaze to her. His eyes were full of a gentle teasing light, an affection so deep it needed no words. "Oh, still holding that ticket, Mrs. Rhodes?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet evening. Evelyn smiled, a slow, sweet smile that seemed to come from the very core of her being. She looked down at their joined hands, then out at the magnificent sunset that was so like the one they had shared on the bluff all those years ago. The question was not about the framed and faded piece of paper on their wall. It was about the journey of her heart. She thought of the desperate, lonely woman who had stepped off that train so long ago, a woman who had believed she was too old, too broken to ever start again. She thought of the fear and the shame that had been her only companions, and she thought of the quiet man beside her who had seen not a ruined woman, but a sunrise. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude and a love so profound it felt as vast as the prairie sky before them. I did, she said, her voice soft but certain. Until you made me realize I was already home. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. They said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. They sat together hand in hand and watched the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a soft purple twilight. They were two people who had been forged in the dust and the silence of the West. Two souls who had stopped running and found their forever, not in a place, but in each other. Thank you so much for joining us for this story tonight. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. Share your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach even more people.